What if the global conflicts we see, you know, playing out on our screens, what if they have much deeper roots? Hidden histories, maybe unexpected alliances way beneath the surface. Today, we're taking a deep dive into that. We're looking at the recent geopolitical chessboard involving Iran, Israel, and Pakistan, and viewing it all through India's evolving strategic lens. Our mission here with this deep dive is really to pull out the crucial insights from the material you've shared with us to give you a shortcut to being well informed, maybe with some aha moments, some surprising facts, but without, drowning you in information. It's a custom journey into knowledge, quick but thorough. So let's start by unpacking what seems like a really fascinating shift in India's relationship with Iran. If we think back, say, to around 2019, the discussion was often about how Indian refiners were, well, mostly set up just for Iranian oil. There was a lot of pressure then for India to stop imports, and frankly, some frustration that India hadn't diversified its sources sooner. We also touched before on how Iranian ballistic missiles weren't exactly precise. So looking at today, what's fundamentally changed? How has India's stance and capability shifted since then?
Yeah, it's actually quite striking how much has transformed since 2019. India's done, well, a very good job, frankly. First off, our refineries, they can now process pretty much all kinds of crude oil. That's a huge strategic advantage that just wasn't there before.
Right, flexibility.
Exactly. And second, India's whole attitude towards Iran, diplomatically speaking, it's definitely hardened. We don't really entertain that old friends narrative Iran liked to use during sanctions, especially, after some, let's say, less than flattering comments were made about India when Iran wasn't under sanctions. That sort of thing sticks.
Okay, so a definite cooling off from the past diplomacy. And what about Chabahar port? That always seemed like a point of leverage for Iran.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources suggest Iran often used Chabahar for, well, basically arm twisting on investment,
Yeah.
strategic pressure. And India has, I think, quite wisely just halted further investment there. Look, we built it mainly to help supply Afghanistan, right? But Iran just didn't let us play our game there. So, lesson learned.
Nick.
And on the nuclear front, India's position on Iran getting nuclear weapons is crystal clear. It's not seen as a good thing at all. And notice India hasn't directly condemned Israel or the U.S. Instead, it's been this quiet but firm message of peace, brotherhood, love, make love not war. This is not an era of war. We're Buddha's country.
Hmm.
Everyone understands it's a criticism, a nuanced one, without needing a direct confrontation.
That's a very sophisticated diplomatic balancing act.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to that nuclear question then. There's this really deep distrust surrounding Iran's nuclear ambitions. Why is it so profound?
Well, this gets into a core principle of international relations, really. You plan based on capability, not just on stated intent.
Capability, not intent. Okay.
Think of it like this, maybe a simple analogy. Your neighbor gets a pistol. Even if you're friends today, maybe allies against someone else, you probably feel you need one too. Because what happens if that external threat goes away? Suddenly you're neighbors, and one of you has a capability the other doesn't. That pistol looks different then. So nations generally try to avoid letting a neighbor get capabilities they don't have. Because today's friend, well, circumstances change. They could be tomorrow's adversary.
That's a pretty stark way of putting it, but pragmatic. Is there a historical example that really drives this home?
Oh, definitely. Look at Iran and Israel. It's almost hard to believe now. But they were very close allies right up until the Shah fell in 1979.
Really close allies.
Very close. And then, almost overnight, bitter enemies. And get this, during the Iran-Iraq War, around 1984, Israel actually supplied weapons to Iran. This was part of the Iran-Contra affair. Few others were selling to Iran then. Yet, fast forward about 10 years, 1994, maybe at 95, Iran gets linked to bombing a Jewish cultural center in Buenos Aires, killed 50 people, including, tragically, the wife of a former Israeli ambassador to India.
Wow, I didn't know that detail.
It's shocking. So you can see why a country like India really internalizes that lesson. Intent can change drastically and quickly. Capability is what you plan around.
Absolute chilling history. So how does Iran's right under the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to enrich uranium fit into this? They say it's for peaceful purposes.
Right, and technically under the NPT, Iran can enrich uranium, even to high levels like 60% or theoretically 99%, as long as it's not weaponized. But, and this is the key point our sources keep hitting on, there's just no clear economic explanation for needing such high enrichment levels for purely civilian nuclear power. From a strategic viewpoint, that kind of capability screams military potential. If you're not aiming for a weapon, why spend so much on getting enrichment that high? It just fuels that deep distrust.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift gears a bit and look at Iran's actions across the region. It seems their influence has caused quite a bit of instability in the Middle East.
Yeah, this really brings up big questions about Iran's methods and how its neighbors are reacting. Our sources paint a picture of Iran being involved in creating, well, a lot of nonsense and mayhem, as they put it, through various proxies. You know the names: Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, various Iraqi militias. They also apparently played a hand in supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to push for regime changes in places like Morocco and Egypt.
And didn't we see a really surprising turnaround from the Muslim Brotherhood regarding Iran later on?
Absolutely. Quite remarkable, actually. Yusuf Qaradawi, who was a major figure in the Brotherhood, known for some controversial rulings himself. He later publicly apologized for ever aligning with Iran. He flat out accused them of trying to convert Sunnis to Shia Islam and told his followers basically stay away from them. It's a huge statement coming from him. Shows you the level of mistrust, even among former, shall we say, tactical allies.
Wow. So this underlying Shia-Sunni tension, it actually creates a kind of strategic opening for India. How does that work?
It sounds a bit cynical, perhaps, but yes.
Yeah.
Strategically, this conflict is seen as, well, beneficial for India. Why? Because as long as it simmers, it makes a close alliance between Pakistan and Iran much harder to achieve. And you see echoes of this even locally. For instance, during the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, there were reports of some Shia communities providing intel, and they themselves faced persecution. Muharram processions were banned for, 15, 20 years? They've only recently started again. So that larger regional conflict has very real local effects, creating this sort of unique space for India.
Which leads to perhaps the most surprising development, this quiet support for Israel coming from some Sunni Arab nations. How did that manifest in the recent conflicts?
It's a massive shift, really underground for a long time, but now more visible. Our sources are pretty clear. Many Sunni countries in the Middle East, though notably not Qatar, have been silently and sometimes actively supporting Israel.
Actively.
We've seen concrete examples. Reports of Saudi Arabia providing refueling bases, the UAE doing refueling for planes, Jordanian airspace being used by Israeli aircraft. And during that big Iranian missile and drone attack recently, Saudi, Kuwaiti, and Jordanian air forces were reportedly up in the air, actually helping intercept Iranian projectiles. Word is Mohammed bin Salman, MBS in Saudi Arabia, was shall we say, quite pleased with how that turned out.
That completely flips the common narrative. How did Iran end up alienating so many potential partners?
Well, analysts point to the aftermath of the '79 revolution. Khomeini's initial moves, the rhetoric, the policies. Within about a year, they'd managed to alienate almost everyone. The Americans, the Arab monarchies, even the Soviet Union.
Strategic missteps, basically.
Big time. And when you feel your conventional military isn't up to snuff, what do? Often you turn to unconventional means like pursuing nuclear weapons and subconventional means like terrorism and proxies. We see this pattern with both Iran and Pakistan. Neither felt they had overwhelming conventional strength, so they invested heavily in nukes and in groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. Though it has to be said, Israel's counter-operations have apparently been quite effective at disrupting and even wiping out many of these groups, according to our sources.
Okay, moving on, there's this paradox that's quite striking. We see pretty strong anti-Israel sentiment in some Indian Muslim communities, yet among Arab Muslims, there seems to be a growing, if quiet, pro-Israel leaning. What's behind that?
This is a really critical point, and it goes deep. Our sources talk about it almost like a 1,400-year-old unfinished business. Yeah. The argument is that for Iran, the fight isn't fundamentally about Israel. That's sort of the surface issue. The deeper goal, or historical grievance, revolves around who should be the rightful custodian of Mecca and Medina.
The custodianship of the holy sites.
Exactly. In Shia theology, there's a belief that custodianship belongs to them, to their imam. This explains, partly, the historical cursing of early caliphs like Muawiyah, Umar, Abu Bakr, Usman, because they are seen as having usurped that rightful role.
So there's a much deeper historical and theological layer that many outside the region might miss.
Precisely. Arabs generally understand this context. They see Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa as maybe the first stop, but the underlying ultimate target for some in Iran is seen as Mecca and Medina. Our sources suggest that many Indian Muslims, being mostly Sunni, often don't fully grasp this deep cultural and historical context. The perception, as some analyses put it, is that there's sometimes a tendency towards rote learning of certain narratives without digging into the complex backstory. And this disconnect goes way back. You can find figures like Ibn Taymiyyah in the 12th century expressing disdain for, say, the Turks, viewing them as uncivilized. It parallels how some Arabs historically viewed people from the Najd desert region versus the civilized Hijaz, where the holy cities are. There's even this concept of takfir, not quite calling someone an infidel, but seeing them as not far from it.
And this historical baggage still affects perceptions today, how Arabs might view Indian Muslims.
Sadly, yes, according to some sources, that perception lingers. There can be a view among some Arabs that Indian Muslims are somehow inferior or lesser Muslims because they don't fully get this intricate context. You even see it reflected sometimes in how people are treated. Indian Hindus, for example, often receive a lot of respects now in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But individuals from Pakistan or Bangladesh might face more negative stereotypes or treatment. And adding another layer, Iran itself wasn't always Shia. History tells us it was predominantly Sunni for about 400 years. The Safavid dynasty forcibly converted the population, even killing Sunni scholars. So some interpretations actually suggest that the current Iranian emphasis on Shiism is partly a kind of strategic ruse to recreate a version of the old Persian Empire, using religion as a tool.
Wow, that's a lot of complex history and motivation packed in there. It's definitely not just about religion on the surface. Now, speaking of influence, how does a small nation like Israel manage to wield so much influence, especially with a superpower like the U.S.?
Well, there's that famous quote attributed to Golda Meir, Israel's first female PM. She supposedly quipped that Moses must have dragged them through the desert for 40 years just to drop them in the one spot in the Middle East without oil, unlike the Arabs who were swimming in it.
Right, I've heard that one.
Her point was, lacking natural resources, Israelis had no choice but to dig into their minds. They had to rely on intellect, innovation, strategy. And that's a big part of why Israel, a nation of only about 9 million people, can have such a significant impact on a superpower like the U.S. with 370 million. It comes down to exceptional diplomatic skill and incredibly effective diaspora engagement. They punch way above their weight.
And you're suggesting this stands in contrast to how some parts of the Indian diaspora operate.
Oh yes, that's a point raised in the sources. Our own diaspora is vast and contributes immensely, but sometimes the focus is more on community building, cultural centers, temples, which is great, but maybe less on direct, unified political engagement. Or, when engagement does happen, it sometimes presents, unique challenges. And this brings us to figures like Zoran Mamdani.
Okay, let's unpack that controversy. Our sources present Zoran Mamdani as really a stark example of these complexities, external influence, internal vulnerabilities here in India.
Right. And his case really forces us to ask some important questions about who is allowed to operate within India and what kind of influences are at play. So, Zoran Mamdani, son of the filmmaker Mira Nair, he's described in pretty harsh terms. In some sources, idiotic person is used. His NGO, the Slambalak Trust, has come under intense scrutiny. There are loud calls detailed in our material for its FCRA registration to be canceled. That's the foreign funding license. Calls to seize its funding, its bank accounts, and even calls to revoke Zoran's OCI status overseas citizen of India, which would bar him from returning to India.
And his mother, Mira Nair, her role is also being questioned in this context.
Yes. It's pointed out that Mira Nair herself, despite not being Muslim though her father was a Gujarati Muslim, is now seen by some critics through the lens of her son's actions as having perhaps intentionally provoked sensitivities in the past. The example given is naming a lesbian character Sita in her film Fire, which was set in Varanasi. Now, combined with her son's reported public statements, described as showing Hindu hatred and allegedly calling Hindus haramas, some are reinterpreting her past artistic choices as potentially deliberate provocations.
So the criticism goes beyond just one individual. It touches on broader policy issues regulating foreign influence, ideological fights within India.
Exactly. The sources ask, why are organizations connected to individuals expressing these kinds of sentiments allowed to operate freely in India? Why aren't investments from figures like George Soros, despite official warnings about potential disruption, scrutinized more heavily, maybe even seized? And it's contrasted again with the Israeli diaspora. Even Israelis who strongly oppose, say, Netanyahu, will often rally to support Israel when it's facing external threats. The point made is that maybe India hasn't quite succeeded in making its global citizens feel like citizens of India in that same unified way during crises.
Interesting comparison. There were also comments about consumer choices.
Yeah, a bit of a side point, but mentioned. Criticism of certain high-end brands, like Raw Mungo Saris, which Mira Nair has connections to, described in some sources as, cheap, no artistry, tasteless, despite being expensive, yet flaunted in certain circles. A sort of critique of elite tastes disconnected from value.
And the political engagement point comes up again with the New York context.
Yes. It's noted that despite Hindus making up maybe 3% of New York's population, there isn't much cohesive political action from the community. And interestingly, some Jewish communities in New York apparently support Zohran Mamdani, even though he's described as an open Hamas supporter and a 12er Shia who believes in Khomeini. Yet, the sources highlight no mainstream Democratic reporter seems to ask him about Khomeini or his stance on Iran.
The sources also draw some very controversial historical parallels regarding Mamdani.
Extremely controversial. They state flatly that Zohran Mamdani, who holds a Ugandan passport and never Indian citizenship, has, in their view, proven Idi Amin right, referring to the expulsion of Indians from Uganda, and even Sanjay Gandhi right, referring to his notorious sterilization program. The implication being these actions were somehow justified by preventing individuals like Mamdani. Very strong claims.
And his political claims as a candidate were also fact-checked in the sources.
Oh, yes. Detailed as confidently making false statements, promising to raise taxes which a mayor doesn't have the power to do unilaterally, promising to arrest Netanyahu and Modi, which again is not within a mayor's power, that's up to police or prosecutors, and only if a crime occurred in their jurisdiction. He also allegedly made false claims about a genocide in Gujarat, saying no Muslims left, which is factually incorrect. Data cited shows 15% of Gujarat's Muslims are actually wealthier than average Muslims elsewhere.
So the sources position Zohran Mamdani not just as an individual case, but as a symptom of something larger.
Precisely. He's framed as a symptom or even a disease of the Democratic Party in the U.S. The sources characterize the party historically as being associated with slavery and segregation, and now, in their view, embracing Islamist communists and supporting what they term an Islamic racist for mayor. It's presented as a pattern, just a new manifestation. Again, reporting the strong views in the source material here.
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's talk about the India-Pakistan dynamic, specifically looking at recent military performance versus public relations outcomes.
Yeah, this is fascinating. What really stands out is the progress in India's own indigenous defense tech. We saw Israel's kamikaze drones used visibly. But the real story, according to the sources, was India's own air defense system, the AD system, developed by Zen Technologies in Hyderabad and Greener Robotics. Its effectiveness was pretty evident, apparently crucial in preventing any major strategic hits on India.
So homegrown tech really stepped up. What about the cost? That's always a huge factor in these things.
Hugely important, and a big win for India here. The Indian counter-interceptors cost something like 300, 400 rupees each. Compare that to the Pakistani drones they were taking out, which cost maybe $500. It's an incredibly cheap solution.
Wow, that's a massive cost difference compared to other systems.
Exactly. Think about Israel's Iron Dome or the Arrow 23 missiles. Those can cost anywhere from $1 million to $6 million per missile. And they might be intercepting rockets worth only a couple of $1,000s. The daily cost for Israel can run up to $1 billion in a conflict. India's solution is orders of magnitude cheaper. Plus, India's Akash missiles successfully intercepted a ballistic missile that's a major milestone, and reports say the Scalp and BrahMos missiles performed fantastically. You can apparently even hear the difference, the Scalp being subsonic, the BrahMos supersonic, flying at Mach 3.5. It's loud.
And this success is linked to internal reforms.
Yes. The sources credit the reorganization within India's missile development programs, and importantly, a proper private-public partnership. Bringing in private industry seems to have really paid off.
Okay, so militarily, a strong showing, but the narrative, the PR side, didn't always match that initially. What were the challenges there?
That's the crux of it. India basically won on the battlefield, but at least initially lost on PR. Our sources suggest it wasn't until about the 10th, presumably the 10th day of the conflict, that India really started winning the PR battle. But by then, the world's attention span, it had moved on. Those critical first 3 days, a golden PR opportunity, were missed.
Why the gap? Institutional issues.
Largely, yes. India doesn't have a dedicated national-level PR machine like Pakistan's ISPR or Iran's propaganda ministry. We tend to rely more on party IT cells, which isn't the same. Now, to be fair, there was improvement, compared to, say, the aftermath of Balakad, where the PR was seen as lacking compared to Uri. This time, while the start was rocky, India apparently learned fast and nailed the template for messaging within about 3 days. So learning is happening.
We saw a specific example with that airspace propaganda from Pakistan, right?
Exactly. Pakistan ran this Twitter campaign for 2 days, claiming India's airspace was used for attacks on Iran, which is geographically nonsensical if you glance at a map.
Right, Pakistan is in the way.
Precisely. But it took India's PIB fact check 3 whole days to counter it. The initial thinking was reportedly, surely nobody believes this, it's basic geography.
Mhm.
But that showed a failure to account for, well, the readers of certain alt news or news laundry type outlets, who the sources bluntly call idiots. The point isn't that policy should be based on idiots, but that in the information age, idiots are more dangerous because misinformation spreads so fast, you have to counter it immediately.
And this ties into the perception issue in places like Kashmir, where fear dictates public silence.
Yes, absolutely. It's crucial to understand, according to these sources, that the vast majority, like 98% of the Kashmiri population, didn't publicly oppose terrorists out of fear, not because they supported them. They used the example of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, reportedly torturing a gay Hamas commander to use him as a scapegoat. That's how fear works in terrorized societies. It enforces compliance. The argument made is, if there was genuine widespread public support for the insurgency in Kashmir, it wouldn't have ended the way it did. Fear, not support, was the dominant factor for most.
Let's look ahead now at the future of conflicts, particularly Pakistan and its current leadership. Pakistan's army chief, Asim Munir, spent a full week in America recently. That seems like more than just a courtesy visit. What might that imply about his situation?
Yeah, a week is a long time for an army chief to be visiting. It definitely suggests serious talks were happening, more than just, diplomatic ice cream socials. Munir is seen as being in a really tricky spot. There's this interesting point raised about Pakistan's crypto economy, apparently. Because agricultural income is in rupees, some in the middle class turn to crypto for stability. And this, weirdly, might give them some direct or indirect access to figures like Trump, given his pro-crypto stance. It's an odd connection.
Huh. And his visit follows a pattern.
Yes, there's a historical pattern noted. Pakistani leaders tend to head to America after they've suffered a significant setback, a nose cut, as the source puts it, like Nawaz Sharif did after the Kargil conflict.
So, internationally, maybe the perception was muddled due to India's PR stumbles, but domestically, within Pakistan's military, the reality was clear.
Exactly. Foreign observers, perhaps influenced by the initial PR war, might think Pakistan came out okay, or even won. But people following the news within India know India achieved its objectives. More importantly, inside Pakistan, the core commanders are reportedly shaken. Their air bases were hit. Destroyed is the word used. None of their missiles hit strategic targets in India, while all of India's missiles found their marks. Asim Munir himself was apparently humiliated in front of his core commanders after the Pulwama attack happened without their full prior knowledge, so his credibility internally is damaged.
Which puts him in a very tight corner, potentially making him more dangerous.
That's the assessment. He's in a very dangerous situation. He might feel immense pressure to launch another major terror attack just to save his own position, to shore up his standing. But he faces this dilemma. If he goes to his commanders for approval, they'll likely question him, given the previous failures. Why will this work now? But if he acts without their knowledge again, he risks even further humiliation if it fails, or even if it succeeds but wasn't sanctioned. So this desperation, combined with the internal friction, makes him, from India's viewpoint, more dangerous for us. Unpredictable.
But facing this, India seems to have adopted a new, pretty clear-eyed doctrine. What are the main points of that?
Yes, India's response strategy is described as very smart and direct now. First, the message on nuclear blackmail is blunt. It won't work. India will do what it deems necessary, operating on the belief that Pakistan's leadership ultimately values money and stability more than martyrdom.
Okay, no more bluffing.
Pretty much. Second, India has stated publicly, we will not ask for proof next time. The doctrine is now unambiguous. A terror attack originating from Pakistan will lead to retaliation. No more debates about evidence packets.
Right.
Third, Minister Jaishankar's statement after the recent strikes was framed as a clever trap. By specifying India hit terror camps, not the Pakistani military, it gave Pakistan an out and outer. They could have just disavowed the terrorists. But Pakistan chose to get involved, defending the camps, effectively owning the terrorists.
Painting them into a corner.
Exactly. And fourth, perhaps most significantly, Prime Minister Modi's warning was stark. Next time India won't just hit terror camps, we will hit your military directly. That raises the stakes considerably.
So pulling it all together, despite those early PR fumbles, the overall result for India in this recent conflict was positive.
Overwhelmingly positive, according to the sources. Described as outstanding, a clean campaign, and fundamentally an undeniable victory. The key takeaway is that India is clearly learning from its mistakes, and learning quickly, even adjusting strategy within the time frame of a single conflict.
As we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's just briefly look beyond the main players. There's other instabilities simmering, like these apparent revolts within Iran. Are they genuine grassroots movements?
That's a really important question the sources grapple with. How authentic are these uprisings? We've definitely seen more activity Kurdish groups, Sunni groups in Sistan and Balochistan, even Azeri groups. Videos are circulating showing them with weapons that look like NATO or American or European issue. And there are reports of Baloch groups actively supporting Kurdish ones. However, the expert view presented is that many of these are largely artificial revolts,
Artificial, meaning externally driven.
at least significantly influenced or supported from outside, yes. For example, Ayatollah Khamenei himself is ethnically Azeri, and Iranian Azerbaijanis, who are mostly Shia, about 63%, generally don't report feeling oppressed as a group. So a widespread Azeri revolt seems less likely to be purely organic. Now, there are genuine Sunni revolts in places like Khuzestan and Sistan Baluchistan. Those areas near the border are considered unsafe. And the Kurds certainly have grievances about Sunni oppression, but culturally, many still identify strongly as Persian. So it's complex.
Which means regime change in Iran isn't as simple as maybe it looked in, say, Libya or Syria.
Not even close. Remember Trump's comment about not always needing boots on the ground? That might apply to smaller, less cohesive states. But Iran, it's huge, half the size of India, with 90 million people. The assessment is clear. Significant regime change there is not possible for now without a major sustained ground campaign. You'd be talking 3, maybe 4 months of concerted effort to dismantle the really powerful structures, the Basij militia, the IRGC, Pasdaran, the mullahs, the army command. It's a massive undertaking.
And their own military structure kind of works against them in a conventional fight?
Ironically, yes. That dual structure, having the regular Army Air Force and a separate IRGC Army Air Force, was designed specifically to prevent coups against the regime. Internal security was the priority. But the side effect, paradoxically, is that it's made them militarily ineffective in some ways. It's like they put all their eggs in one basket for regime survival, but when it comes to projecting conventional power effectively, no egg hatched, as one source vividly put it.
Okay, so let's try to quickly recap this deep dive. We've really covered a lot of ground, from India's strategic evolution and maturity regarding Iran and Pakistan to digging into the hidden histories and motivations driving these regional conflicts and seeing how crucial it is to learn from mistakes and adapt quickly. It's clear that what we see on the surface in geopolitics is often just, well, the tip of the iceberg. Now, just a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. Thinking about everything we've discussed, how might those internal pressures within Pakistan's military leadership, specifically Army Chief Asim Munir's really quite precarious position, how might that actually shape regional stability in the coming months? What does his potential unpredictability mean for India's strategic thinking? Looking beyond just direct military conflict, something to consider until our next deep dive.